Welcome back to the channel. So last time we started on this rocker arm and got most of it finished up. We're going to finish this last little bit up on the rocker arm today so we can go ahead and get that mounted and get it marked off the list. So I got to make the screw for it too. And then we're going to make the push rod and the bracket that continues back this way towards the cam. Okay, so when I put this in the lathe the last time, and I was able to machine off this section here, so I was able to mount it in an arbor and then machine this entire piece down to this thickness here and to this final diameter here. But then I tried plunging in. We need to machine off this section around here, but initially the problem was they didn't have enough stick out on the tip of the tool, and the bottom of the tool was actually starting to rub against the sides here and here. So I could come up with I could grind a tool, a high-speed tool, steel bit wouldn't have that problem, that would actually come into here to machine this off. But I think the problem with that is by the time I come out to here to clear this up, when this is spinning around, that it's going to clip this inside piece here. Might be okay, but it would be pretty tight. So I think to finish this up, I'm going to set it up on the rotary table with an end mill, so we can just come in here and spin this around and just go ahead and machine this off. Then we could just flip it over and do the same thing on this side. This one's a little bit big. The whole thing needs to be machined down, but we'll get this surface machined down to here. Probably do it with a ball end mill, so we'll end up with a nice radius on the transition between this boss to this face here. So we'll get that set up in the rotary table and finish that up, and then go ahead and make the screw, the adjusting screw that goes into here. And then that's just going to be probably a socket head cap screw or machine screw that needs a spherical end on it. So I'll take the welder and just weld a little blob on the end there, and we can kind of shape that around. Then that'll screw into here, and then can take the lock nut and lock that down. So let's get that set up and get it done. Okay, so that went pretty good. Got that set up on the rotary table and took a 1/8" end mill and machined around there and got all that rest of that material there machined off. on both sides. And then I did a lot of hand finishing. It's a really complicated part to make. There's a lot of different surfaces and machining operations on it, so I tried to blend them together the best that I could, but I think it turned out pretty good. It'll at least do the part. So then I took a 632 screw and just TIG welded up the straight slot in it there, and then kind of formed that into a ball shape. And it said to use a 3/4 inch long screw, which looks a little long to me, but we'll figure out once we get the clearance and everything set with the push rod if we need to trim that off. And then we've got our lock nut there. So we'll put this on and just see how it looks. So our bolt goes through there, and we'll tighten that up. Snug that up there. And it gets a lock screw on the bottom. I'm not sure that it really needs that, but it shows a nut on the bottom. And there we go. Looks like it's going to work good. Open the valve good. Like I say, we'll get that adjusted, get the clearance adjusted on there. I'm not sure where it's going to end up at, which will change the contact point between this and screwing the end of the valve some, depending on whether we're farther in or farther out. We'll look at that once we get the push rod made. So we're going to start on that section next. We got a push rod here, and we've got two brackets that are made out of brass that'll actually bolt to the casting to hold this push rod in. Then this one bracket gets a little horn on it here where the spring hooks to, and then in the end of it here we've got a roller axle bearing. So this is pretty small, 3/16 tall, 3/32 thick. So I've got this piece of steel here that I think is going to work. It's about 10 thousandths too thick, but I think I can cut me off a section here, and then we can machine this down flat, and then it's about 5 inches long. And I'll probably take it on the belt sander and knock off this. This is galvanized, and it's about 10 thousandths thicker than what it's supposed to be. But I think once I knock this galvanizing off, it'll be about right. And most importantly, it looks pretty straight. We'll check it once we get our piece cut out. If it's not straight, then we can always start with something thicker and machine it down. But once you start getting that thin there, sometimes you can get some bows in it. It's hard to get a piece straight that's that thin. One other option too is, instead of doing this bracket here kind of on the end and soldering this gets silver soldered for the axle and the bearing, you could start with a solid piece and then just machine out all of this section here and leave this, and then machine out for the bearing. It's more machining and more material waste, but it is another option instead of silver soldering that. We're going to try it like this first to make this bracket and get this soldered. But if this doesn't work or doesn't end up good and straight, then we might abandon that and start with a bigger piece and then just machine out this section here where we don't need it. But we'll start with the brass pieces. I've got this piece of brass scrap piece here that I think we can get both of them out of. We'll need to machine out the section where the push rod runs, and then it gets 2 holes drilled in it, and then it's a little bit large, oversized. And I've got a little scrap piece here that I think we can shape into something and solder onto the bracket, put a hole in it to hook the spring to. And then for the axle, I'm not sure yet. I've got this scrap piece here that's the right size. It's 1/4 inch. It's got an 1/8 inch hole in it, and it's a little bit wider. I can hold on to it, machine that off, and then cut that off and make an axle out of it. I think it's a pretty hard piece, but I'm not sure. If not, we'll come up with something else. This needs to be a 1/4 inch OD, and then it says to rivet it lightly to that, so we'll have to come up with something soft, probably either some aluminum or copper is what I'm thinking. Get an 1/8 inch hole through there, have it just a little bit wider to where we'll probably go ahead and peen over one end, slip it through, and then we can hammer on and kind of peen on the other end. But it needs to be flush. I think it needs to be completely flush, or as flush as we can get it in the back. There's not going to be much sticking out. But first thing we'll do is get this set up and get these brackets machined out, and then we'll get this piece cut off and see if that's going to work for us to make the pushrod out of. Okay, so I got the push rod done. That was just a piece of metal that I cut off with the bandsaw to start with. It was the right thickness, and then machined it down to the overall width that I needed and the overall length. And then when you get a piece that's this thin, especially just mild steel, you got to be careful about it bending. I did lay it on the surface plate to check it. It did have just a little bit of a bow into it, so I put it in the arbor press and just tweaked it a little bit to get it as flat as I can, and I've got it pretty good and flat now and good and polished. So then I cut these two pieces here out of brass. They're just simple brass pieces with holes in them, and then two slots there, and then the slot is just wide enough for the push rod to fit in there. It should just barely be, and we can adjust it a little bit with a file if we need to once we bolt it on, but you can just barely catch your fingernail on the brass there. So these pieces will bolt on here, here, and here, and then that'll hold our push rod between the cam to the rocker arm. So these will bolt on here like this. That'll keep the rocker arm, or keep the push rod straight and in line with the rocker arm. So then I made this little thin piece here, which is difficult when it gets this thin to hold on to. So I machined this shelf into it first, and then I went ahead and put the hole, drilled and reamed the hole in this. So we'll actually use this as a drill guide to drill the other hole into the push rod. So this will get soldered on to the end of it like this. So once we get that soldered on flush here on the end, then I can use this as a drill guide and go ahead and drill and ream all the way through it. And then there will just be a little round wheel in here. So we'll make that out of some 1/4 inch drill rod. It's an 1/8 inch wide, and then I went with a 3/32 hole here, and then we'll make a rivet to put in there and kind of peen the end of it just to keep that secured there. And then for the little horn, one of these pieces, the back piece here, gets a little, what they call a horn on it, that has a hole in it to hook a spring to. So I cut out this piece of brass here. I'll just cut this out with the Dremel and then filed it. So this will actually get soldered to here. So once I get this soldered, then there's a height measurement of where the hole goes for the spring. And then once I have that hole, and then this is soldered on, it's a little easier to hold on to, then we can cut this off with probably the Dremel and then shape this with the file to the final shape that we want it into. So I'll have to solder this and solder this on there next time, and then make the wheel and get that peened on. And then this push rod here still gets two holes drilled and tapped into it, but it says to locate these from another piece that actually bolts onto there. So we'll probably make that piece first, then we can set it on there and then mark our holes. There's a measurement from the wheel here and from the end of where that piece goes. So we'll do that once we get that piece made. Once we get all this soldered though, we'll have to transfer these holes into our casting here and then get these drilled and tapped so that we can get this bolted on. But we'll start on that next time. Thanks for watching.